In book after book, physicists and biologists have argued that in point of fact, we now know, because we are scientists, that the religious beliefs of mankind are now, have always been, and will always be in error. This despite the curious fact that not one of the great physical theories mentions the existence of God in its premises or in its conclusions. Nonetheless, the scientific community is persuaded by access to some form of a multiple insight into nature that we now know that the religious beliefs of mankind are in error. Now, I think it's true that all men at some time doubt the existence of the deity, and some men at all times doubt the existence of the deity. I don't mean to say that this is good or bad. I think it's the human condition. We grope, we're in the dark, we're not sure of what we're doing. What is so curious is to look at the number of books affirming that science has shown that God does not exist. And that is a very emphatic declaration. It's like the declaration that there is no number between 4 and 5. That's a demonstrable fact. There is no natural number between 4 and 5. So these people are adopting a platform of declaration of some vigorous effect. What is so interesting is to see that directly after the books have made it to the bestseller list, in conversation or in interviews or in scribbles not widely noted, they walk that particular dog back discreetly. Before his death, I had an opportunity to debate Christopher Hitchens. He was at the time terribly sick, so I hold him to no account with respect to what he said. But having made an enormous success by means of the proposition God is not only not great, he's not there, Hitchens was asked how certain he was of this conclusion. And he said in his own inimitable fashion, well, it could be that there is something like a world spirit. That's a very different proposition from the proposition that God does not exist. Richard Dawkins has made a fabulous career writing about the inexistence of God. But when you look at his book, what you see is not a defense of the proposition God does not exist, but a defense of the proposition, well, probably he does not exist. To say probably he does not exist is not to achieve deductive certainty, isn't he? Because there are plenty of opinions which might suggest that probably he does exist. In case after case, it's apparent that this vigorous, ebullient defense of atheism, when examined, repairs to the standard view that human beings have held since time immemorial, which is, it could be, or on the other hand, maybe not. When you look at the climactic enthusiasm for the new atheism, in London there's a bus with a placard on the side. God does not exist, have a great time. I'm paraphrasing. Although why God's existence should preclude having a good time, I'm not entirely clear. I would think you'd have a much better time if you were certain that God did exist. Nonetheless, the ebullience with which the new atheism is affirmed conforms perfectly to Freud's doctrine of the return of the repressed. Because as soon as the spotlight of publicity, which is necessary to sell books, is dimmed, and as soon as the lecture hall spotlight is diminished, every last one says what we all would say. Maybe, maybe not. Could be. Who am I to say? That is the return of the repressed. And that is a point of criticism of the doctrine that the sciences have a unique form of accessibility to reality. Because that doctrine is poisonous and untrue. One of the dominant convictions urged upon the human race by the scientific community concerns a certain myth. That the progress of science, which is real, which is very powerful, which is very significant, no one should doubt it, has meant progressively a disenchantment with nature and a form of cultural humiliation whereby at every step in the development of the sciences, human beings and their works have been demoted from a central position and reduced to the margins. Apparently, Stephen Jay Gould, for example, argues this. This process began in the 16th century with the discovery that in fact, the Earth is not the center of the universe. It continued step by step over the course of 3 centuries. And it reached an apogee with Darwin and the discovery that, in fact, human beings are nothing but a continuation, squalid enough, of the animal kingdom, cousin and kin to every shambling and repulsive thing that lives, and hardly distinguished from the great apes except for the acquisition of a few adventitious characteristics of no particular significance. Get used to it. I admire Stephen Jay Gould. I must say that. I think he was a sensitive and intelligent writer, but he said some lamentably foolish things. He said that the insistence, as I would insist, on a difference in kind and not simply in degree between us and the great apes, is simply a mark of our cosmic arrogance, an inability to let go. But in fact, any cursory examination of the great apes and human beings reveal profound and striking differences, not only in the organism itself, biomechanically, physically, biochemically, but above all in its nature and soul. Here's a simple operational test, which I've mentioned many times to the community of evolutionary biologists. You're having trouble distinguishing a difference in kind rather than degree between you and a chimpanzee. Here's a simple test. The chimps are on the other side of the cage. You're not. It's quick, it's effective, it's operational, and it's infallible. Chimpanzees don't talk, they don't do mathematics, they don't speculate, they don't dream, they don't cook, they can't clean up after they make a mess, they dine inadvertently, they don't dance, they don't do music, they can't play an instrument. What more do you want as a difference in kind rather than degree? What more do you want? Alfred Wallace, who discovered the theory of evolution a little before Charles Darwin, was struck by this. He couldn't quite reconcile what he understood with what he was claiming. In that respect, he was a very honest scientist, very penetrating intelligence. He said, look, you go to the Amazon forest. You take an Amazonian headhunter, age of 6 months, family of headhunters. You move them to Oxford in England. Give them a classical English education. The children of the Amazonian headhunters will be in all respects indistinguishable from other graduates of Oxford. That is to say, they'll speak perfect English, they'll have a wonderful ethnic advantage that they can use in acquiring positions at the BBC, namely that they're headhunters. They will be able to do mathematics, they can learn medicine, if they wish to dance, they can do anything they want. But Wallace said the remarkable thing is, human life unlike chimpanzee life, human life seems to offer us this very suggestive account of unopened gifts in the human community. Now, if all these marvelous properties that human beings have developed in this way, how is it that we can go to an Amazonian community or the community of Eskimos and we can discover these gifts waiting and dying to be used? If those gifts are part of the human inheritance, they are not Darwinian. And if they are Darwinian, they are not there, because unused gifts have no role to play in the struggle for survival. After all, speaking with a polished BBC accent does a headhunter no good. This has been called Wallace's problem in the literature. And of course, biologists are happy to call it Wallace's problem because it sounds so much safer than saying human beings are created in the image of God. That cannot be said, even though it comes to the same conclusion. In the 18th century, a French philosopher, very clever, said, look, I've got a button here, right on my table. You press this button, you get anything you want, anything. Untold riches, the love of beautiful women, inexhaustible power, anything you want. The only slight impediment is that 10,000 miles away in China, a peasant will drop dead in his tracks. You will cause his death. The question that he raised is, who amongst us would refrain from pressing the button? And who amongst us would be content to have that button in wide currency? I've always thought that was a profound moral question. A profound moral question.
For far too long, we have been assaulted with the view that science has a voice all its own. Well, let me impart a secret to you. It doesn't. It doesn't have a coherent body of theoretical principles that are uniform throughout the sciences, and it doesn't have a method beyond any method that we would use in any particular human pursuit, golf, for example. If you try carefully to demarcate or delimit the scientific method, what you get is a series of trivialities. Be careful, cut the cards, look at the evidence, do an experiment if you can, and for heaven's sakes, don't trust anything on anybody else's word. And if your experiment fails, the last but most important principle, blame someone else. Those are superb principles. I endorse them, but they do not characterize science as a separate discipline. So if science has no organizing body of principles, either in its assumptions or its conclusions, and it has no distinctive method, to my way of thinking, it follows, right, that it cannot speak with a single voice. It just can't speak with a single voice. Consequently, when I hear a physicist saying, like Vic Stenger, look, science has shown that God does not exist, my natural reaction of irritability is augmented and immeasurably improved by my conviction that the guy is a lunatic. A conviction I've held to the present day. But beyond that, I would say in response to Bruce's question, if anyone wanted a list of things where science in the year 2008 is pretty much where it was in the year 1208, I would say the origin of the universe, the nature of the universe, the meaning of life, the cause of existence, the reason for existence, the nature of the human mind, the nature of the human body, a complete mystery, why we have opposable thumbs and no other primate shares them, why we have mathematical, moral, sophisticated abilities in the arts, why we love music, why we devote ourselves to one another. How's that as a list? Of which we have not even a prayer of understanding.
The question is, what does it take to transform a land-dwelling creature into a sea-dwelling creature? Or, if you want an analogous question, what does it take to transform a 1976 Chevrolet Camaro into a submarine? It's the same question. It's the same question.
Or an ape to a man?
No, this question is more specified because we have a much better intuition about the changes. We know just what it would take to take a Camaro and make a submarine, a whole lot of work. But my question wasn't that this story was plausible or implausible. I have no interest in that question. My question was rather, do we have any quantitative measure of the number of changes, just anatomical changes? After all, we take a cow or a moose, the first thing we got to do is make it waterproof. How do we go about making a mammal waterproof? Not a simple business. The skin is a complicated organism. How do we teach it to breathe 500 miles under the water? How far down do whales go? I'm in the ballpark, right? How do we get its blow spout or whatever those things use to the top of its head from the bottom of its head? How do we persuade this creature to give up eating grass and go munch whatever whales munch? Can we come up with a numerical estimate of the number of changes? And I said, I have no idea. These are very complicated questions in morphology and comparative anatomy. But I was able to say, well, back of the envelope, about 50,000. Say it's wrong. Say it's 5,000, 500,000. I don't know, but you don't know either. The point is, when you go to the paleontological textbooks, the question, how many fossils do we see that fit this pattern? And how many fossils might we expect rationally to fit this pattern? That question is never asked. Never asked. You go to the leading experts on caudate paleontology, James Carroll, a wonderful scientist. I looked through his textbook. Yeah, I understand there are all sorts of intermediates like Ambulocetus natans that have been discovered, and those are wonderful confirmations of Darwinian theory. There is an intermediate sequence, but there are only 7 of them. If there are 50,000 changes, what happened to the remaining 49,000 changes that should be in the fossil record? Can we explain that away? Is it plausible? It is plausible. My point is the question is not properly asked. It's a sign of intellectual flabbiness in Darwinian theory, one of many. Look, the stuff about finch beaks is certainly interesting. Let's not confuse ourselves about that. The question is, can it be extrapolated, or does it represent cyclic variation? I can say, here's an account of how the eagle flies. Look, I get up, I jump in the air, I flap my hands a couple of times, and I land a few feet from where I started. Thus, the origin of flight. Now, the obvious response is, this is nutty. You can flap your hands as long as you want. You won't fly like an eagle. The argument from extrapolation can work in some circumstances. It fails in other circumstances. Plainly, in the case of a human being who jumps 2 feet in the air and then lands 2 feet from where he started, the argument from extrapolation fails. What persuades you in the case of the Galapagos finch that what seem to be cyclic variations are the start, the commencement of a grand process of speciation? That's a step in the argument that has to be completed. It's not enough to say, well, it's more of the same. It's not more of the same self-evidently. It can easily be bounded variation of exactly the same sort as we see in any species experiment. Now, the contrary may be true. We may be seeing the development of entirely new species. The Galapagos finch starts off as a finch, and within 100 million years there'll be a Galapagos elephant. Could be. But we need a whole lot more by way of evidence than a couple of nutty journalists going down there looking at finch beaks and writing a Pulitzer Prize-winning book. A whole lot more of this is to be serious science. I mean, this doesn't even pass the threshold of anecdote. Finch beaks change in size. Yeah, they do. They change in shape, too. It seems to be correlated with seasons. It seems to be a regress back toward the mean when the seasons change again. If this is the part of a spectacular evolutionary extrapolation, let's have additional reasons for thinking that. Otherwise, we're not even talking about a scientific hypothesis. The interesting argument about the whale, which is a mammal after all, it belongs to the same group of organisms as a dog, a human being, a chimpanzee, or a tiger. The interesting argument about a whale is that if its origins were land-based originally, then we have some crude way of assessing quantitatively, not qualitatively, but quantitatively, the scope of the project of transformation. The project is very simple. Let's put it in vividly accessible terms. You've got a cow. You want to teach it how to live
all of its life in the open ocean, still retaining its air-breathing characteristics. What do you have to do from an engineering point of view to change the cow into a whale? This is crude, but it gives you the essential idea. Now, if the same question were raised with respect to a car, and you ask what would it take to change a car into a submarine, we would understand immediately it would take a great many changes. The project is a massive engineering project of redesign and adaptation. Well, the same question occurs with respect to that proverbial cow. Virtually every feature of the cow has to be changed. It has to be adapted. But since we know that life on Earth and life in the water are fundamentally different enterprises, we have some sense of the number of changes. Anytime a science avoids coming to grips with numbers, it's somehow immersing itself in perhaps an unavoidable, but certainly an unattractive miasma. Here's a chance actually to put some numbers on calculations. We're not talking about genetics. We're talking about simple numbers. The skin has to change completely. It has to become impermeable to water. That's one change. Breathing apparatus has to change. A diving apparatus has to be put in place. Lactation systems have to be designed. The eyes have to be protected. The hearing has to be altered. Salivary organs have to be changed. Feeding mechanisms have to be changed. After all, a cow eats grass, a whale doesn't. As I say, I've tried to do some of these calculations. The calculations are certainly not hard. But they're interesting because I stopped at 50,000. That is morphological changes. And don't forget, these changes are not independent. They're all linked. If you change an organism's visual system, you have to change a great many parts of its cerebellum, its cerebrum, its nervous system. All of these changes are coordinated. So when we're talking about an evolutionary sequence such as this, what's interesting about the cow to whale transition, and I'm just using this as a easily accessible idea. What's interesting about the cow to whale transition is that we can see a different environment is going to impose severe design constraints on a possible evolutionary sequence. How are these constraints met if they're roughly 50,000? If they're 2 million constraints, how are those met? And what does this suggest about what we should see in the fossil record? To my way of thinking, if Darwinian hypotheses are correct, it should suggest an enormous plethora of animals, intermediary between, say, Ambulocetus and the next step. That won't solve all problems. One wants to know what's directing this change, if anything. But at least it will put it in the ballpark of a quantitative estimate, which is hardly ever done. The idea that science is a uniquely self-critical institution is, of course, preposterous. Scientists are no more self-critical than anyone else. They hate to be criticized, and they never criticize themselves. Given the enormously long span of human history, this is a prediction that one would expect to be true, and it is true. There are local mechanisms of criticism in science. I mean, within established theories, if somebody publishes data that don't work out in the right way, or if there are mathematical flaws in a certain theory, these tend to get known. But large global criticisms of the scientific enterprise are very, very difficult to find, and certainly are not being promulgated by the scientists themselves with any great ebullience or enthusiasm. Look, these people are only human. They hate criticism. Me too. Me too. It's not a surprise. The idea that scientists are absolutely eager to be beaten up, that's one of the myths put out by the scientists, and it works splendidly so that they can avoid criticism. Let's be reasonable. We're all sophisticated men and women here. I mean, the popular myth of science as a uniquely self-critical institution, and scientists as men who would rather be consumed at the stake rather than fudge their data. I mean, that's okay for a PBS special, but that's not the real world. That's not what's taking place. I mean, people fudge the data whenever they can get away with it. And they will commit themselves to fraudulent drawing just so long as they're convinced that no one's looking over their shoulder. And it's unrealistic, unsophisticated, and unwise to expect people to do anything other than that. Think of your last traffic ticket. Yeah, you bet, officer. I was doing 98 miles per hour in a 30-mile-an-hour school zone. When was the last time you told the cop that? And yet we expect a biologist to say exactly the same thing about drawings which have been his stock in trade for the last 100 years.